Good evening. I am Ann Applebaum. I am the director of the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute. And what I had hoped to be doing this evening was to welcome all of you in this room and also to welcome a live stream audience. However, the Legatum Institute has just been hacked by hackers in Bogota, Budapest, Indianapolis, and several other places. So we've taken down,
Kaliningrad.
And Kaliningrad. So we will tape this book presentation, and we will put it on our website at a later date. But to me, it's really very extraordinary that the presentation of a really quite literary and sophisticated book about Russia would attract this kind of attention. And I think it's actually a testament to Peter Pomerantsev's book and the power of literary language. So as you know, I'm here introducing Peter, and I'm introducing Ferdinand Mount. Peter is a journalist, a broadcaster, and the author of Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And another interesting thing about this book is that it is unfortunately not available for sale here because it sold out, and they have to reprint it. So sadly, you won't be able to buy a copy, but you can buy one at your nearest Waterstones tomorrow morning, or order it from an unnamed retailer online. Peter will speak about the book. The book to me is an extraordinary achievement because it's a book about modern Russia, but it's a sort of modern version of The Heart of Darkness. It's a kind of journey through the various layers of Russian society. And I said that to Peter earlier today, and he said, no, I thought it was more like Dante, each circle, circles of hell, so he chose an even more elevated literary model. But Peter will explain a little bit himself, but he worked in Russian television for 7 years?
Far too long, less than a decade.
A very long time, and this was his observation of how it changed while he was there. There are many Russia experts in London, and Peter and I, between the two of us, probably know all of them, and some of them are here in the room. But we decided that to talk about this particular book, we wanted Ferdinand Mount for a number of reasons. Those of you, he is one of those people who needs no introduction, but he's the author of many memoirs and great novels and all kinds of other things. He's the former editor of the TLS. He rolled his eyes when I said I was going to say this, but he was a former advisor of Mrs. Thatcher. But he also wrote a book that both Peter and I noticed, and Peter in particular noticed and asked, and this is really his idea that Ferdy should come here, about the new elite in Britain and the relationship of the new elite to British society. And because part of Peter's book is about the relationship between the elite and society, we thought we might start off talking about Russia, and we'll start off talking about Peter's book, and then we'll move rapidly into more spiritual and moral and philosophical questions. Also, Peter says he's sick of talking about his book with Russia experts. So, so anyway, we'll begin. I'll begin with Peter. Would you like to would you like to introduce the topic? Would you like to, the most irritating thing, I've done book tours, and the most irritating question anybody ever asks is, why did you write this book? And I always feel like saying, because I can't sleep anyway, but, but give us the motivation for the book and what you wanted it to be, and give us an introduction to it. I also asked Peter, because it's such a beautifully written book, I asked him if he would read a very short passage. So he'll explain.
I wrote. Is there anybody here familiar with the book? It was sort of briefly dramatized on BBC. So I wrote the book because of Moscow. I wrote the book because I realized that I'd just seen a miracle turning into a nightmare, and that someone had to write it, and that I had a perspective on it that was unique. And so the material said write about me. I had no intention of being a writer. I was quite happy being a tabloid TV producer and moonlighting as a policy wonk. I kind of moved between the two worlds. It was just the material was so good, and I realized I couldn't make all the stories into films, that I had to put it on paper. And as I wrote it, I realized the society I was describing, which was a unique society. I knew that this sort of society had never existed before because of specific historical conditions, post-communism, oil boom, money, all these things happening at the same time in Russia. As I wrote it, I realized this society was actually going to a very bad place because it had no values, had this sort of bizarre nihilistic view on life, and yet was expanding at the same time in its sort of imperial ambitions. And around 3/4 of the way through writing it, far before Ukraine had started, I was like, oh my God, this is going to end up as some sort of fascism, because this is the logic of this ideology. And lo and behold, just as I was writing this, Russia went ballistic. And my agent would say, my God, did you set this up? And I was like, no, but it was implicit, I realized, in the world that I was describing. So, I mean, I arrived in Moscow in 2001, and I'd always wanted to live in Elizabethan London or 1920s New York, or somewhere where a city's nervous system was sort of outside its skin. And I'll read a couple of little extracts to explain to you, because people ask, why did you go to Russia for 9 years? And I go, it seemed like the place to be. Performance was the city's buzzword. A world where gangsters become artists, gold diggers quote Pushkin, Hell's angels hallucinate themselves as saints. Russia had seen so many worlds flick through in such blistering progression, from communism to perestroika to shock therapy, to penury to oligarchy to mafia states mega rich, that its new heroes were left with the sense that life is just one glittering masquerade, where every role and any position or belief is mutable. I want to try on every persona the world has ever known, Vladek Mamashov Monroe would tell me. He was a performance artist and the city's mascot, the inevitable guest at parties attended by the inevitable tycoons and supermodels, arriving dressed as Gorbachev or Fakir Tutankhamun, the Russian president. When I first landed in Moscow, I thought these infinite transformations the expression of a country liberated, pulling on different costumes in a frenzy of freedom, pushing the limits of personality as far as it could possibly go to what the president's vizier would call the heights of creation. It was only years later that I came to see these endless mutations not as freedom, but as forms of delirium, in which scare puppets and nightmare mystics become convinced they're almost real, and march toward what the president's vizier would go on to call the Fifth World War, the first non-linear war of all against all. So that's sort of an opening of the book, and try to capture sort of the excitement, the sort of hallucinogenic sense of a society which really doesn't believe in anything and has this almost sort of Nietzschean sense that it's above any kind of ideology, and life is just one endless sort of performance, which was exciting and then became very threatening.
And you wanted to read something about how it ended, or not? Or do you want to talk first about the turning? So you were in this very glamorous place where people were trying on costumes. And what was the moment when it began to turn, or when you began to think it was different from what you had expected?
Well, I mean, I worked in TV, and TV gave me a very unique perspective on Russia, because in Putin's very odd authoritarian system, the underlying ideology is one of the sort of triumphant cynicism that democracy is a lie, communism is a lie, that any kind of political gain can be arranged. But the way this is sort of channeled and turned into a system is through television. So the first thing that Putin did when he took power was seize control of television. And so my first meeting in Moscow took me to this sort of secret room where so-called political technologists and heads of TV stations would literally dictate what the public would see, so as to manipulate them in a way convenient to the Kremlin. So
what was this room?
Well, it was a room it was the Russian version of the BBC Centre. It was a Ostankino. And everyone would sit around going, we know there's no real politics. We have to create this simulacra of democracy, this sort of little drama that imitates democracy to keep people distracted and confused and loving Putin. And so they go like, so let's have some crazy communists on, and we'll tell them what to say. They'll say something so crazy makes Putin look good by contrast. Then we'll have some fake right-wing people on, and they'll say something so crazy it makes Putin look good by contrast. And we'll get them to row. So it looks like a democracy. It looks like they're having a debate. But the whole thing is designed and written like a scripted reality show or like a drama. And so as I worked in the system, it was fairly shocking. And Russia is really like one huge scripted reality show with the Kremlin kind of directing all the different streams in a way that suits it. It's a much more sophisticated form of authoritarianism compared to sort of the top-down pressure of the Soviet Union.
And what is it for? I mean, so there you were in the room where they're making these, making these political decisions and creating this game, and toward what end was it? I mean, what's the point of it?
Well, initially the point was it was a facade. So behind the facade of all this sort of dancing pseudo-politics, there was very, very real and massive corruption. So hundreds of millions, billions were being siphoned away and usually ending up in and around this area of London. So the whole thing was like a distraction mechanism for something very, very real and practical. But increasingly, because the Kremlin was so bewitched by its own power of propaganda, so convinced that it could really change people and control society through TV, that it began to kind of think about, well, why don't we use this in foreign policy? We can't compete with the West in terms of tanks and missiles and guns, but can we use our mastery of propaganda and TV to subvert Estonia, start a war in East Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So now we see them using TV really as a weapon, sort of the weaponization of information. But the book ends, after my sort of like adventures in Russia, going sort of deeper and deeper into this society, the book ends with me coming back to London, thinking that I would find the same London that I had left in 2000. And I come back a decade later, and I find sort of in this bit of London, in sort of Belgravia and Knightsbridge and Mayfair, or almost like an echo of what I'd seen in Moscow, both visually and aesthetically and morally, also a lot of the same people. Also, I was again working on crap TV. So in Russia, I made crap TV, and I came here, and the first show I'm told to make is like, can you make a show about rich Russians? And I'm like, okay. So I made a terrible show for Fox TV about Russians in London.
I don't think it was terrible.
Have you seen it?
I've seen part of it.
Well, the show was based on this idea that, oh, look at these crazy rich Russians, let's laugh at them. And I kept on saying, okay, you can laugh at them, but the joke's on us, because when I would meet the sort of the oligarchs and their wives, they talked about the English the way the English used to talk about Irish builders. They were like, oh, you can't trust the English, they come round to fix our radiator, and they always rip us off. They think we're so stupid. And so it's I kept on saying, you've got to bring this out. You've got to bring up the fact that these people, you're laughing at them, but they're actually laughing at you because they're richer than you. And they see you as their butlers now. But the channel refused to recognize this. That was not a message we wanted to send out to our viewers. We wanted to comfort them by laughing at the nouveau riche. And we never really explored the other side of that. So
you had a passage you wanted to read from that era, from the end of the.
I'll read it. So this is me once I've come back all the way to London, and I meet this guy who organises parties for sort of the Russian super rich. He had a club just around the corner from here, near the Burlington Arcade. And his parents had been asylum seekers. That's how he got to London. So his name's Sergey. When my mum and dad asked for asylum here, they probably thought I would become English, British, whatever, says Sergey. But in the world I work in Mayfair, Knightsbridge and Belgravia, I often end up speaking more Russian than English. The English aren't the ones with the real money anymore. They might still rule over the other side of Sloane Square, down in Chelsea. But in Mayfair, they can't keep up. A good club night brings in 110,000. That's 3 times more than out there. At the tip of London, the city breaks through and out of England and into a different space, which is neither Europe, nor the Middle East, nor Asia, nor America, but somewhere altogether offshore. Sergei's clientele are the golden youth, the kids of Russian and Ukrainian and Kazakh and Azeri bureaucrat businessmen. The roles are hyphenated. Sent away to be educated at the prettier boarding schools and then on to international business schools in Europe and America. Wellington and Stowe, with their porticos and playing fields, are favourites. The more patriotic the Russian elites become, the more they sing hymns to orthodoxy, autocracy and Tsarism, the more they damn the West, the more they send their children to study in England. In a previous age, when the English were the club you aspired to join, some new immigrants would change their names, from Vinogradov to Grade, Mironov to Miron, Brockovich to Brook. But that wouldn't occur to the golden youth. Why bother when the richest people in the city have non-English names anyway? The parents of the golden youth send their children to boarding schools not because they want them to become English, but because it's the status thing to do, along with having a home in Saint-Tropez or a bank account in Switzerland. But neither do the golden youth I meet peg themselves to Russia. They don't deny their roots, but their reference points run Hong Kong, Geneva, Fifth Avenue, London, south of France, and from there to private yachts, private planes, offshore. Having one nationality, whether American, Russian or British, seems passé, a little 20th century. Should I go on a bit more, or?
I think we might want to ask Ferdy.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a nice time to come in.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt the flow. I mean, because to say I'm not a Russian expert is a heroic understatement. All I know of Russia comes from books, from Dostoevsky and Gogol and from Bob Conquest and Richard Pipes and all I can say of this book is that it's worthy to add to that list because it gives you a completely fresh picture of Russia today, which has not been conveyed to us sitting here until this moment. And I think it's a very remarkable book and written, I don't know why you say you're not a writer, because it's written with great style and elegance, and some of its vignettes of delving into the underground, as previous Russian writers would have called it, are very touching. And so the stories of injustice, the Magnitsky affair, in itself is a horrific saga. So I strongly urge you to read it when you can get hold of it. But insofar as there's any reason for me being here at all, it is, I suppose, to compare it with our own homegrown elites, what I call the new few. And I mean, it's true there have always been mineral elites, particularly on this rocky island, that all the plutocrats of the 19th century, their fortunes, the Lambtons, the Londonderrys, the Norfolks were based on coal and iron and tin. And then there were inrushes of mineral elites from elsewhere, the landlords from South Africa, the Australian gold rushers, all figure so wonderfully as villains and mystery men in Sherlock Holmes sagas. We've had them all before, and they washed round the establishment and were jeered at for their vulgarity and courted for their wealth. But basically, they were coming up against a very long-established state with an independent judiciary and a strongly entrenched tax system. G.R. Elton, the great Tudor historian, said that I thought it was a bit strange when I read it, but actually I sort of see what he means. He said that the thing that had distinguished the English state from the earliest years was that when taxes were levied properly, the English paid them. And this was a rare thing among nations of the world. And I've actually, the last few weeks, I've been reading a whole lot of books about Magna Carta. And a strange way, I've come to think of Putin as rather like more successful version of King John, except that he's adding to his empire while John Lackland was losing his. But you have this strange, same struggle of the barons, a pretty rough lot themselves, attempting to establish an independent institutions within the state. And the most important clause in Magna Carta is not the famous ones, which are still on the statute book about to no one shall we sell or deny or delay justice. They are the ones, the security clause, which said they're going to set up a bunch of 25 barons who are going to invigilate John and make sure that he observes the terms of this charter. And that this idea of an independent force within the state is the most precious and difficult one to establish, and it's one which the illusions of pluralism, which Peter describes so brilliantly, skate over and can fool people for years and years that they are living in a pluralist sort of democracy, which may be a bit ramshackle, but ultimately everything is controlled by the master magician in the Kremlin. I think particularly the postmodern impresario of the whole thing, what's he called, Vladislav Surkin, is a wonderful figure of setting up, as Peter just described, these opposing forces for TV. TV, of course, is wonderful for this because all TV shows have to have conflict, and so the false conflict is a wonderful way of giving people the feeling that it's all fine, it's full of life, it's a genuine, rumbustious sort of democracy, when of course it is as described in this great book.
But you started saying something. You said in the olden days, when the various plutocrats from different countries came to Britain, they encountered this, they at least encountered this very strong English state, and which collected taxes. Were you then going to imply that that's no longer the case?
I was going to imply that the English state, or the British state, needs and is beginning to show signs of pulling its socks up and coming to understand that certain things have to be regulated. There have to be rules, and that tax havens, which we thought were an agreeable safety valve for the system, are in fact a temptation that is never resisted. And the gradual opening up of the Swiss banks and the HSBC saga this week is a sign that the state, and I'm not sort of making a thing between one political party or another, but the British state is very, very slowly beginning to realize that certain structures have to be put in place to make a tolerable world, and to bring back the footloose new elite into some relationship in the societies in which they squat.
I love the idea of Belgravia as one massive squat. Yes. So, but on the tax thing, I mean, isn't there a paradox there? On the one hand, we want to be the world's global centre, so we want everyone coming here. On the other hand, this need to stiffen the sinews. How do you get that balance right technically? Because every time I talk to people about it, they're like, but they'll go to Singapore. It's always Singapore, which is an interesting kind of why is it Singapore where we're so paranoid?
Yeah,
or
but
Dubai.
one reason that people want to come here and squat is because the system is basically still honest. And after all, that wonderful lawsuit between Abramovich and Berezovsky took place in a London court because they thought this is the place where you get it done fairly and squarely. So the reputation for honesty and transparency is also attractive. It's not just because you can take the money out and then go and take a very large, very heavy suitcase around Geneva and remove 2 million quid. You do want a system which is honest, and you want judges who are honest, and so I don't regard the whole thing as being beyond redemption.
There is,
but it takes. But I would just say, obviously, it takes a hell of a time to get it back.
There is an interesting paradox that you and I have talked about before, which is that there's sort of two images of London in Russia. I mean, one of them is exactly as you said. It's safe. The law works there. The legal system is good. It's a predictable, regulated society. On the other hand, it does also have the reputation for being a place where you can bend rules, and as you say, that's where something like some huge percentage of the world's offshoring goes through London. And it's so much so that among the Russian opposition, such as it is, it's relatively small. There are mixed feelings about the West. The West is okay; it's the place, and London being the kind of, the zenith of it. On the one hand, yes, the West has rule of law. On the other hand, you can bend those laws, and that's how our oligarchs became rich. I mean, there's very much the sense in Russia that, and they're technically right. This is how it happened. Money was taken out of Russia. It was laundered through Western offshore accounts and then brought back through Russia to build the sort of ex-KGB state that we have today.
I think one of the things that we didn't, which in Russia as here, is we were completely taken for a ride by what these nimble freebooters, who I call alchemist oligarchs, who can turn dreary public utilities like oil and gas into a stream of gold. And outside the mineral thing, one of the most fascinating things, I think, is in the way in which they've turned into global sport which used to be run by ridiculous
The
figures
British,
ridiculous figures in blazers who weren't paid. Suddenly, it is football and motor racing have become real money spinners for monopoly oligarchs. And I thought your bit about the Winter Olympics as another example of how everyone gets in cahoots and the thing costs 10 times as much as it needs, and Putin and the oligarchs share the proceeds. So it's the thing of the state taken unawares, and not pausing to think how you're going to handle things like the denationalization of these industries, which, I mean, I'm not saying we did it perfectly by any means here. There were tremendous confusions and mess-ups, and a lot of people got away with quite a lot, but nothing on the scale of Russia. But again and again, it comes back to this thing of a weak state with weak state institutions, and they take a very, as we all know, a very long time to rebuild, or to build for the first time.
Peter, could you parse for us a little bit the what is the West to Russia? I mean, I know that it's changed over time, but in the beginning of your book, you talk about how all these Russia seemed to be playing with Western toys when you first arrived there, and new ideas and new images and new people. But can you? What does it mean? And can you talk a little bit about the interaction between Russia and the West in the last decade and what that's produced?
Well, I mean, Russia and Britain are very similar in the sense that in Britain you keep on getting into this conversation: are we part of Europe or are we a unique empire? You have the same conversation in Russia all the time. So there's a very old conversation about is Russia part of Europe or not, which mirrors the British one. For the Putin elites, and I guess that's as opposed to maybe the cultural figures, the West is yesterday. Their claim is that however much a state stiffens the sinews, their vision of the 21st century is one where those sort of state institutions really don't matter. The institutions built on that, the UN, the EU, NATO, don't matter. That we're in a chaotic 21st century with money going backwards and forwards, with identities very smudged, with borders irrelevant. Russia isn't really a country, it's kind of a concept that you can play with. It's very postmodern in that sense. It doesn't need borders. Or those borders are constantly, moving around, depending on which side of bed Putin gets up on. But so they see a 21st century where the West and its ideas of order, justice, all these things have really been obliterated, and where everything is just manipulation and play. And I'm not sure sometimes whether they're not right. I mean, Russia might destroy itself for various sort of self-destructive reasons, but I can't get rid of the feeling that actually Putin and Surkov are right. The 21st century is going to be this century of manipulation, chaos, where all the institutions are gone, and where the West, as such, as we knew it, just is sort of like, a bit of an Atlantis. So whenever sort of Obama goes, Putin is stuck in the 19th century, that's the opposite of what the Kremlin elites see. They see a 21st century which they understand much better than we do. They keep on coming back to one idea: our system collapsed, your system will collapse. That's what they keep on coming back to. This is like their driving force. Can't you see that your system is as fragile as ours was? And the future is just anarchy and non-linear war, as they call it.
And the children that you write about, I mean, the children who go to school here and are brought up here and play rugby at Wellington, what's going to happen? What are they?
Well, we try to explore that. I try to explore that in the book, and it's interesting. We don't know yet, but it's happening right now. This is the interesting thing. But it's funny. I mean, they don't want to be English. They don't want to play this game of becoming English. They're richer than the English. Why would they want to be in the English club? So they definitely are. They're part of this weird sort of island above our island, which is sort of full of the global super rich, whose values remind me a lot of Moscow, because people there have made their money very, very, very fast. They don't want to think about the past. They don't want to think about their identities. They don't want to think about reputation or any of these things. They see life essentially as play, sort of like, buy a house here, put on a costume here, avoid taxes there. It's very, very sort of like playful, and they're nothing like the old aristocracy with their kind of values and systems.
And
So-
Peter, do you think they want to go back to Russia?
No, God no.
They never want to. Not even a small fraction of them want to build a new Russia.
The way
They have
want-
no feeling for that.
They can do, but that feeling doesn't really matter. I mean, they're hyphenated. Sure, they can have some feeling for it, but the reality of their lives is this endless movement. I remember asking Abramovich's wife, where do you live? And she's like, I live in a plane. I mean, I don't have a sense of, I don't set, it's this, this time we're going back to offshore. They have an offshore identity, or lack of an identity. When you talk to them for a long time, they're often, they question this a lot. They feel quite lonely. They're like, I don't fit in anywhere apart from five-star hotels. But they're very aware of the fact they don't really fit into any national system. But you always had the jet set, you always had cosmopolitans, but now this is sort of a class of people whose kind of economic decisions sort of like influence the rest of society. So they're much more important than they used to be. They're not just sort of, froth.
The thing I wanted to ask you is, how much do you think that this Putin's aura of being the shape of the future depends on a successful, aggressive foreign policy of taking over successive border fringes, that it needs to have that kind of ongoing expansion into sort of successive Sudetenlands, as it were?
But they can be Sudetenlands of the mind, certainly, because his reputation is built on being like the biggest capo in town. That's kind of what it's built on. It's not built on sort of law and regulation. It's built about being the toughest man in town who could sort out the barons and can sort out the West and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is how they perceive of that now. So in the Russian idea of what they call information psychological war and how they see the wars of the future, they talk about contactless war, a war fought purely in the realms of perception and cyberspace. So the fact they've had to invade eastern Ukraine, I think he finds vaguely annoying. He was really going to subvert Ukraine through a series of endless sort of psychological and PR games, and then something went wrong, he had to send in some troops. But so they see the war with the West as one to be fought purely in the mind. So if they can subvert the story of the EU and successful transition, they've already won. If they can subvert the story of the White House being all powerful, NATO being credible, that's enough. We keep on thinking, where are they going to land a bomb? They don't need to. They just need to show that it's ridiculous and that Article 5 doesn't work. So this isn't in their theory. This isn't my casual conversations. This is in Russian military theory. They predict the 21st century is going to be the century of contactless war, the war of pure perception.
I must say, that, judging by quite a few people I've talked to or read in the papers in the last few months, he's doing quite well on that front, because there is an argument which you hear on the right, really rather more than the left, which is that, Russia has a right to feel a bit encircled and needs to feel a great power again, and you can understand why Putin is so popular, and the presumptions of NATO and the EU, that's not surprising. It's riled them, and so that in this sort of soft war, I think he's doing quite well. I mean, a lot of people are inclined to that view.
The best phrase, I think, is one that you used. You may even have invented, which is this idea of liquid ideology. Yeah. One of the oddities of Putin, and which is why I think he's been so hard for the West to understand, is he will take allies anywhere, far right, far left, business community, Tory realists who think, Russia is a great power and was always a great power in the 19th century when we were, and therefore it deserves to have its great power status back. They'll work with anybody. I mean, there's almost any combination of allies who will promote the cause. They're not really bothered.
Well, just like in domestic TV, they'd have sort of like, the idiot communist and the idiot right-wing guy. They now, can manipulate any narrative in the West. This might be a trend. A friend of mine, David Patrikarakos, was writing about the last Gazan conflict. And he said it was a unique conflict because it broke down the Clausewitzian idea of war, which is here's the war, here's the peace. and war is a way of achieving some sort of goals on the ground. He said the last Gaza conflict, it didn't actually matter who won it. Both the Israelis and Hamas knew that they would bomb each other for a bit, people would die, and then would go back to the status quo. Neither had any intention of pushing the lines forward. All that mattered was the war, the information war, the narrative war, who could lie better, tell their story better, and so on and so forth. Look at China. China are developing concepts of three-way warfare, where a huge amount of the stress is put on media and psychological war, with the aim, from what I understand, I'm only just getting through the reading, to split Japan from America and sort of reorganize the alliances in Southeast Asia. But again, without ever touching. The point is never to touch. If you've touched, you've kind of messed up. And ISIS, again, what a very powerful example of people just using information and perception and narratives in a way that is just, changing the face of our relations to the Middle East. So this seems to be a global trend, and this is what the Kremlin is saying. They are the most postmodern power that way. They are focused on a conflict of pure spectacle. It's something they trained at home, and now they're kind of finding that their weird world resonates with the rest of the world. When I was in Russia, I thought it was a freak show, essentially. I thought this was a weird society. But now it's come to maybe being in tune with the future.
Thank you all very much, and come have a drink next door.